I have to include the message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I have to.
Wow.
I
Wow.
have to. Have to. And, it's kind of hard sometimes to process and think through, what's pop, what's too pop, what's too, like one that's very obvious I'm not going to put in there, but it's not because I didn't think it was worthy. It was on my list. I never thought I would take it out. But the more I'm thinking and hearing, I'm like, you know what? Like, I feel like the message has affected me more than this other thing or this person. The message is Ta-Nehisi Coates writing um, reflections, three big reflections on three different places. So, Dakar, Senegal, where he tracks going back to some roots and also doing exploration of the African diaspora. Um, Columbia, South Carolina, where he talks about book banning and specifically the banning of his own books and a reflection of that. And then the lion's share, the large portion of the book, is dedicated to Ta-Nehisi Coates' reflections on Gaza and the Palestinian genocide that is happening currently, and that is what it is. It is a genocide, and beyond just the writing excellence, right? The writing excellence. Ta-Nehisi Coates has mastered the ability to say hard things and maintain his soul.
Hmm.
And I don't know if he's definitely not a believer. I'm not talking about soul in that context, but to maintain who he is and stay true to who he is and say hard things at the same time, that is a constant wrestle, a painful art, a confusing discipline. In many ways, I don't think people understand, and I've said this before in many different contexts, but people do not understand how vulnerable, exposing it is to remain true to yourself when you have to say hard things to people who do not want to hear them. And the amount of soul exposure that happens, it's not just an exposure physically, it's not just an exposure emotionally and mentally. There's a soul exposure that happens when you have to say hard things, when you constantly have to justify um, your opinion, your argument, and not in the context of good faith, but in the context of racist dismissal, when you have to constantly bolster yourself and you wrestle with the reality of, did I say something, did I miss something, did I not say something well, did I, and seeing kind of the reaction to him, particularly in regards, of course, to Palestine, and some of the antagonistic journalistic interviews that he's had to navigate on public platforms, to
It
where
was
people
brutal.
are,
One of those went viral
yeah,
when
where
when
where
when the journalist said, if I was reading this and I didn't know who wrote it, I would think, a Hamas operative with a backpack full of explosives might say the same things, basically
and it
accusing
just
him of
jumped
anti-Semitism.
out the interview. First question that he asks is that, it's like, really? His
Which was an
response to that
accusation.
also,
Yeah.
absolutely, couched in, damning language, damning with faint praise. Um, then his interview with Ezra Klein, which I thought was not as vitriolic, but I also thought was curious. And not to say that Ezra Klein does not push people in the same way, other ideologies in the same way. I don't know if I've ever seen him push them like that.
Mm.
There was a level of like, really, you know, um, and again, maybe he does, on a regular basis. I can't recall that level of intensity. Um, and even though I thought some of his questions were fair, I thought a lot of his questions were fair. But the ability of Coates to remain integrated, to not disintegrate in those moments, but also to say, I have thought myself clear on this. And I've thought myself clear to the point of not just intellectual clarity, but key moral clarity.
Wow.
I have
That
moral
part.
clarity on this. And
Hmm.
I think it was a challenge for me, knowing that Coates is not a believer, to say it should be convicting for me to see such moral clarity and to know that there are areas, issues, places in my life where I don't have the same level of conviction. Not because I don't know, but because I'm not willing to say. And I think those are that's the message has pushed me in that regard. Even to the place of saying, I don't, maybe it's too much. Maybe pushing too far, maybe going too hard. And then when
Mm.
you read someone who's literally, putting their career, professional life on the line, even while being, you could after Between the World and Me, you could skate. I mean, white
Didn't have
white
to write
people,
another thing. Yeah.
white liberals are still talking about Between the World. You could just skate free. You don't have to do We Were 8 Years in Power. You don't have to do the Moynihan Report. You don't have to do that stuff. You don't have to do any of that. You have to do the message. You don't have to talk about Palestine. You can just skate on that money for the rest of your life. But he says there's more I want to say. And for that, I honor that level of courage, that level of moral clarity pushes me and inspires me. And sad to say, there are many times where we have the moral bluster in equal amounts in the church. We have the volume,
Mm.
but not the depth of moral clarity.
I don't say this lightly, but he is to me the closest analogy we have to James Baldwin today.
Without a doubt.
Many others have said this, but this is why. Everything that you're articulating is why. So James Baldwin grew up in the church, knows the church, could kind of take the church or leave it, but understood it and was able to speak in that vernacular and in a way, particularly around morality, that has resonance with religious people, spiritual people, people of faith. And he's also an author and artist who was so compellingly, eloquently honest that you couldn't look away. You couldn't ignore. And that's what Coates is. Some people are really honest, but it's kind of a screeching loud. Could you turn down the volume? Because everything you're saying is on 10. And it's not even that I don't want to listen. It's just my ears can't take it. But he's able to have nuance and modulation and not at all soft selling it. As a matter of fact, like you said, having a courage that it actually shames a lot of the rest of us for not being as bold.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So I haven't read it yet because I know it's heavy. I know it's thought provoking and all of that stuff, but I need to read it. I want to read it.
It's a quick read too. It's not a long read. It's a quick read.
Another brilliant move of a great author. You don't have to write 700 pages. That's good, man. That's good. Okay, so I'm going to keep on this sort of religious tip, but I'm going to add a splash of politics to it. And I don't quite know. Well, I have two names for this next cultural artifact. This is my last one. I think it's my last one. It is Thin versus Thick Political Theology, or Politics in Black and White, Christian Edition. So we have not yet mentioned the 2024 presidential race and election. Now, if that ain't a cultural artifact, I don't know what is. But I don't want to mention the race in aggregate or in general. I want to mention the presidential election in terms of a Black Christian political theology and a white Christian political theology. So let me just share this data with you real quick. This is from the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, and they did about a month after the election, they released these post-election results, so which fine-tunes and is a bit more accurate than the initial exit polls. I just want to focus on these religious groups, white evangelical Protestants and Black Protestants, how they voted. 85% of white evangelical Protestants who voted for Donald Trump, with strong support across church attendance levels. 86% of Black Christians supported Kamala Harris, showing overwhelming alignment with democratic values and candidates. So let's think about that one data point. 85% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. 86% of black Christians supported Kamala Harris. They are the mirror image of one another in the opposite directions. Now, Robert Jones, the founder of PRRI, brought this up. And he, born and raised in Mississippi, he was Southern Baptist for much of his life. And he's like, the white evangelicals have been on the wrong side of slavery, on segregation, on issues of public justice for centuries, and politics for centuries. Might it be time to pause and learn from our black brothers and sisters who are, if you put them on two poles on a spectrum, white evangelicals, really white Christians in many ways, but in particular, white evangelical Protestants and black Christians would be on the polar opposites of that spectrum. That ought to tell you something. That ought to tell you that we are interpreting the Bible, the faith, and politics in almost completely diametrically opposed ways. Absolutely. And there are no other religious demographic groups that are that far apart. And what's so interesting is, on paper, we would probably share a lot of the same beliefs. That's where this tension for me comes in with the term evangelical. Are you a black evangelical, Jemar? Well, no, I don't use that term. But on paper, we're not that far apart on the basics of the faith. But it's the application of the faith, or I would say theologically, it's political theology that we are so very, very, very far apart from. Yes. And then the last point I'll make on this is higher church attendance is correlated with more support for white Christian nationalism, the Republican Party, and Donald Trump for white Christians. Which, here's the implication. Churches are vectors of white Christian nationalism. You don't like that language? Churches are super spreaders of white Christian nationalism.
Yeah, super spreaders.
For white Christians. So it's not that they're getting all this white Christian nationalism stuff from the culture, from news, from the political landscape. They're getting it from their churches. Yes, the pulpit, but also Sunday school materials, conferences, retreats, the entire constellation of what Christian churches and parachurches do, in many instances, is reinforcing white Christian nationalism among white Christians. And essentially, the opposite is true for black Christians. Churches are reinforcing ideas of an inclusive, participatory democracy. And until white Christian America sits up, really sits down, and takes a seat.
Come on, bro.
Listening to the black Christian tradition, our politics will always reflect a fractured, not only political reality, but ecclesiastical reality as well. So that is my last cultural artifact, thick versus thin political theology, which I talk about and write about on my Substack, or Politics in Black and White, Christian edition.
Bro, we've been saying the same thing for about 13 years. It is wild. And so much of it is the consistent commitment to say what everyone already knows but refuses to do. And so, amen. Amen to it all. Amen.